Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Today's January 6, 2024, the third anniversary of the violence at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Now, I didn't need to remind you of that because the news media all week has been taking this opportunity of it being the third anniversary of that violence to trash Donald Trump, trash Donald Trump supporters, trash the Republican Party, and put out more propaganda about how Donald Trump is a danger to this republic and should not be president of the United States, and further should not even have the opportunity to become president of the United States because he ought to be removed from the ballot based on Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Now, I've talked about all of that at great length. I've talked about the riot. I've talked about the reasons for the riot. I've talked about how it wasn't an insurrection. I've talked about how the 14th Amendment is not applicable. I've written about it. I've talked about it on this radio show, and I'm tired of it. And you're probably tired of hearing me say it too. But if the media and the Democrats, my apologies for being redundant there, if the media and the Democrats are going to continue to bring this up and lie about it, then those of us on the right, and I don't just mean politically right, I mean correct right, those of us on the side of the truth, have no choice but to rebut it every single time. Because it doesn't do any good to rebut it once and then allow them to repeat the lie multiple times and not respond each time. Because a lie unrefuted becomes accepted as the truth. So yeah, I'm real sick and tired of talking about this. And I'm certain you are real sick and tired of hearing me talk about this. But because the left has taken this opportunity of the anniversary to trash Trump, pull that scab off the wound, and continue to lie about it, I have no choice but to tell the truth about what happened 3 years ago today at the Capitol in Washington, D.C. Now, let me begin by saying that the riot that happened at the Capitol was the stupidest thing the Republicans could possibly have done. It was pointless because they weren't going to change anything, and I'll get to a moment about what they were asking for and what should have changed, but the cowards in the Congress on both sides of the aisle, the Republican cowards who wouldn't stand up for the truth, and the Democrat cowards who don't care about the truth, what the protesters and the fraction of them that turned into rioters that day were asking for was perfectly constitutional. Now, the protest itself at the Ellipse, with all those speeches culminating with Donald Trump's speech, that was a colossal waste of time because the certification of the Electoral College votes, despite all the malfeasance and unconstitutional processes that occurred, was a fait accompli. There was simply no way that Congress was going to reject enough Electoral College votes to put the decision of who would be president and vice president into the hands of the House for the president and into the hands of the Senate for the vice president. Biden and Harris were going to be certified no matter what. So the speeches were pointless, the protest was pointless, and the riot, of course, was even more pointless, and it was criminal. And those who broke into the Capitol and those who committed violence that day at the Capitol, they should be prosecuted. And of course, they have been. But those who simply walked through the building, especially the latecomers long after the barricades had been removed, those who committed no violence whatsoever but were simply present in the building, they too are getting decade-long felony prison sentences? That's an outrage. But let's talk about that day. Video proves that not all who entered the Capitol building on January 6th entered forcefully. Video exists of Capitol Police removing barricades, opening doors, waving in and welcoming many of those protesters into the building. So those people who were simply there really committed no crime other than what? Maybe trespass, but even that, you'd have to have mens rea. You'd have to have some criminal intent. And if they were waved in, or if there were open doors, I don't see where the criminal intent is even there. But regardless, they've been prosecuted as if they are the worst criminals in the history of our republic. The Justice Department has thrown the book at every single one of them that they can identify and prove were there. And of course, it's been played up as an insurrection. And it wasn't originally called an insurrection. It was originally called a riot, because that's what it was. But once the Democrats realized that if it was an insurrection, and that if President Trump engaged in that insurrection, or gave aid and comfort to those who did, then that would make him ineligible for the presidency, even though it doesn't, under the 14th Amendment. So the word riot was replaced with the word insurrection, or coup, or attempt to overthrow the duly elected government of the United States. None of that was true. What happened 3 years ago today was not an insurrection. It was not a coup. It was not an effort to overturn an election or an attempt to overthrow the government. Those protesters had no chance of getting what they wanted. But what they wanted was for Congress to do its constitutional duty. And what they were asking Congress to do was 100% constitutional, and that was to reject the Electoral College votes from the states who conducted unconstitutional elections. Which states were those? Well, there were 7 of them, at least. Maybe more. We know of 7. Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, California, and New Jersey. Now, we'll take California and New Jersey out of this discussion because those states' electoral college votes would have gone to Biden no matter what. And I don't just mean at the ballot box. I mean, had those elections been invalidated, as they should have been, the state legislatures of both those states were heavily Democrat, and so they would have voted to send Biden electors and Harris electors. Okay, so California and New Jersey would have gone for Biden anyway. But Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona all had Republican majorities in their state legislatures. And so if the elections in those states had been invalidated, as they should have been, because they were unconstitutionally conducted, then the state legislatures would have gotten to choose who the electors were to the Electoral College. And assuming they voted along party lines, all 5 of those states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona, would have sent electors for Trump and Pence, and Trump and Pence would have won. Biden-Harris got 306 Electoral College votes. Trump-Pence got 232. But if any 3 of those states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, any 3 of those, Trump-Pence would have won. Now, is it my opinion that the elections in those states were unconstitutionally conducted? Well, sure, it's my opinion. Opinion based on fact. And I wrote about it in my blog, and I talked about it on this radio program back then. But I've got no authority. But do you know who does have authority? The judicial system. Judges in those states. And do you know what happened in March of 2021? Judge Christopher Murray, a judge in Michigan, ruled that Michigan's Democrat Secretary of State violated the law when she ordered election officials throughout the state of Michigan to accept and count mailed ballots that lacked sufficient signature verification. In other words, Judge Murray ruled that Michigan's election was illegally conducted. Now, he didn't invalidate it, not that it would have done any good anyway. By then, the damage was done. There was no way to undo it by that point. He said in his ruling that although the 2020 election was illegally conducted in Michigan, he specifically was ruling that, well, that's water under the bridge, can't do anything about it now, but in the future, you can't do that. And do you know what happened in January of 2022? Judge Michael Boren in Wisconsin ruled that Wisconsin's election was unconstitutionally conducted. Because in Wisconsin, they use absentee ballot drop box, despite them being specifically prohibited by law. Wisconsin law required ballots to be returned either in person or by mail. The use of drop boxes was not authorized by law. But despite that, there were more than 500 ballot drop boxes illegally used in the 2020 election in Wisconsin. Now, whether or not a ballot drop box is a good idea, and there are valid arguments on both sides, I think the bad idea arguments far outweigh the good idea arguments, but let's acknowledge there's arguments on both sides. But that's irrelevant, because Wisconsin law said it was illegal to use drop boxes for ballots. Period. End of discussion. Nothing else matters. But they were used, which means the election in Wisconsin was unconstitutionally conducted. Ergo, the results should have been tossed. What else happened in January of 22? A 5-judge panel of the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court ruled that Pennsylvania law was violated in the election. Pennsylvania's Act 77 allowed residents to vote by mail for any reason. But the court ruled that Act 77 violated the Constitution of the state of Pennsylvania, specifically Article 7, Section 1, because the Pennsylvania Constitution didn't allow residents to vote by mail for just any reason whatsoever. Now, is vote by mail for any reason whatsoever good policy? Maybe, maybe not. But that's irrelevant. What's relevant to the court is, what does the law say? And in this case, the law actually said you could do it, but the Constitution said you couldn't, which means the law was void because it was unconstitutional. Now, all three of those decisions were rendered long after it could have done any good, because the Electoral College votes had already been certified and Biden and Harris had already been inaugurated. But remember what I said. Donald Trump would have only needed to have won 3 of the 7 states that conducted unconstitutional elections: Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, California, and New Jersey. Well, based on these judicial rulings, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania conducted illegal elections and should have been tossed. Now, the other states did so as well. But these are judicial rulings that found that. But it was too little too late. Had those Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania courts made their proper rulings in a timely manner, instead of so long after the fact, it would not have been too late to remedy the election theft of 2020. But by the time they ruled, it was too late. But Congress could have remedied that. And that is what the protesters of January 6th wanted done. I'll explain how Congress could have done it had they cared about the Constitution when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Today is the 3rd anniversary of the riot at the Capitol, what the Democrats and their allies in the propaganda press are calling the insurrection. And of course, they're taking this opportunity to remind everybody of what happened that day and to paint Donald Trump, Republicans, and anybody else who supports him with a broad brush as being violent, anti-American insurrectionists. Some have even called them domestic terrorists. But what they wanted Congress to do that day was perfectly constitutional. Now, Congress was going to certify those election results no matter what, even though they shouldn't have. And so, as I said in the first segment of today's show, the protest was pointless, and the riot was even worse, but what they wanted Congress to do was perfectly lawful. Congressional certification of the Electoral College vote is not merely a rubber stamp formality. There actually is supposed to be some real thought that goes into it. The Constitution calls for the United States House and the United States Senate to certify the Electoral College votes so that they can act as the final check that the results of the election, and therefore the electoral count they've been given, were valid. And in the United States, the election is only valid if it's constitutionally conducted. And the 2020 election wasn't in at least 7 states, 5 of which matter and would have changed the outcome, 3 of which had judges determine that they were unconstitutionally conducted. And what should have happened was those judges in those states should have ruled early enough that they could have thrown it out before January 6th and had the state legislature instead come up with the electoral slate. That's perfectly constitutional. You might recall in 2000, Bush v. Gore, when Gore lost the election in Florida and challenged the election results. Oh, wait a minute. Does that mean he was an insurrectionist? Did Al Gore attempt a coup? Oh, yeah. Democrats can't possibly do any wrong, so no. What am I thinking? But when Bush v. Gore was going on, the state legislature was called into special session for the purposes of determining who Florida's electors would be, because Florida was going to be the deciding state. Now, had Al Gore won his home state of Tennessee, Florida's electoral college votes wouldn't have mattered. But Al Gore lost his home state of Tennessee, so Florida did matter. Whichever way Florida went, well, that's how the country was going. And while this was winding through the courts and there was no certainty that it would be resolved by the deadline, the Florida legislature was called into a special session for the purpose of voting who the state's electors to the Electoral College would be. And of course, the Republicans held the House and Senate, and they would have voted for electors for Bush Cheney. As it turned out, the Supreme Court of the United States properly, and 7-2, by the way, ruled that what Al Gore was asking for was unconstitutional, that it violated the Equal Protection Clause, because that clause requires electoral processes, both as to how the votes are cast and to how the votes are tallied, requires that they be uniform throughout the entire jurisdiction, in this case, the state of Florida. Al Gore was asking that they not be done uniformly. And in a 7-2 ruling, the Supreme Court said, no, that's not constitutional. The subsequent decision that there wasn't enough time for the recount, that one was 5-4. And that's the one everybody says, oh, George Bush was selected, not elected on. But had those judges ruled soon enough, when there was still time, Trump-Pence would have been reelected. The Supreme Court was asked to weigh in the case of Texas v. Pennsylvania. And I read it. It was a very lengthy lawsuit, but I read every word. And that case had serious merit. But the Supreme Court threw it out. Not for lack of merit. In fact, the Supreme Court never even considered the first allegation made in the lawsuit. The Supreme Court threw it out on the grounds that Texas didn't have standing to sue over what Pennsylvania did. And while I think that was an erroneous decision, the bigger mistake was when Donald Trump didn't take Texas v. Pennsylvania grab a Sharpie, cross out Texas, and write Trump, and then hand it back to the Supreme Court as Trump v. Pennsylvania. Because Donald Trump absolutely would have had standing. Why he didn't do that, I have no idea. He was getting terrible legal advice. Instead, he was arguing, vote fraud, computers were changed, Venezuela servers, they routed it through Italy, and they changed the vote, Dominion voting machines, they were, it was just ridiculous. And I said at the time it was ridiculous, and said what should have been done. The reason what Donald Trump was pursuing was so egregiously stupid is because it couldn't be proven. Certainly not in time. Of course, it hadn't been proven ever, but in time. When you allege fraud, hey, this person did this fraudulently, that person can say, no, I didn't. And now you've got a fight over the facts. And it takes forever to get to the bottom of them, assuming you ever do. But what I advocated at the time, and which unfortunately Trump didn't pursue, was don't even argue fraud. Argue the Constitution. Argue the processes that were used in those states. Those loosey-goosey election rules that were allowed to happen under the guise of protecting us from the coronavirus. Many states allowed illegal elections to take place. They allowed mail-in ballots to be counted without signature verification. They allowed mail-in ballots to be counted long past the deadline, the absolute finite deadline established by law. And because those elections were so loosely conducted, they violated the Constitution, that the elections be handled in the manner prescribed by law. You can't just make it up as you go along because there's a virus around. Can't have people gathering at a polling place. So those elections should have been tossed. But here's the argument, okay? By going to court on the constitutional angle, you didn't have to argue or prove any facts whatsoever because the facts were known. Pennsylvania didn't say, we didn't accept late ballots. They acknowledged that they did. Pennsylvania didn't say that they counted ballots that lacked legally required information on them. They acknowledged that they did. Pennsylvania didn't say they voided signature requirements required by law. They acknowledged that they did. Wisconsin didn't deny setting up unmanned ballot collection boxes, despite a state law specifically prohibiting them from doing that. They acknowledged that they did. Wisconsin election officials didn't deny counting ballots that lacked certain voter information required by statute. They acknowledged that they did. Georgia didn't deny bypassing the legislature to impose new rules that materially altered the rules required by Georgia law. They acknowledged that they did. Michigan election officials didn't deny that their absentee ballot poll books didn't balance, meaning that the number of absentee ballots received and processed didn't match the number of votes that were cast by absentee ballot. They acknowledged that those books didn't balance. And it would be bad enough if it was one book that didn't balance. It was 70% of the books didn't balance. And in Nevada, election officials found so many discrepancies in their election process that they did throw out election results. Not for the president, though. They threw out the results of the election for Clark County Commissioner District C. They were the same ballots. They were the same processes used. But if the process was so flawed that they didn't know who legitimately won a county commission seat, how could they possibly have been confident that they knew who won the presidential election? They couldn't be. Those facts were never in dispute. which means you didn't have to argue any facts whatsoever. All you had to argue was the law. All you had to argue was the Constitution. So the court, and it should have been the U.S. Supreme Court, and had they not punted, it would have been, and that was perhaps the worst thing the U.S. Supreme Court has ever done, was refusing to hear the very legitimate challenge to the 2020 election. But all the court would have had to do is properly say, okay, all sides agree that this was done? Is that allowed under the law or under the Constitution of each state? No, it's not allowed. But you acknowledge that was done? And this side, you acknowledge that was done too? All right. Well, then there's no dispute. The only question is that violation of the law sufficiently egregious that the result should be tossed? And I think they would have had no choice but to rule that, yes, the results in those states should have been tossed. I'll explain how that would have and should have worked when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Had the courts in the states that conducted unconstitutional elections in 2020 ruled in time? Or had the Supreme Court ruled in time? And keep in mind that Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania courts did rule that those states ran unconstitutional elections. They just determined that too late to do anything about it. But had courts ruled in time, state or federal courts, there would not have been a do-over. There wouldn't have been a new election. But Plan B, which the Constitution established, and Plan C, which the Constitution also established, could have been utilized. And what are Plan B and Plan C? Well, the election results in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona should have been invalidated. And then the state legislatures of those states, had there been time, would have chosen their electors. And as I said, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona all had Republican legislatures, and assuming they voted along party lines, those 5 states would have gone to Trump, Pence, and they'd have been reelected. And keep in mind, they only needed 3 of those to win. Any combination of those 3. And in 3 states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, judges did in fact rule that the elections were unconstitutionally held. They just ruled too late to do anything about it. But even then, Congress had the ability to step in and right that constitutional wrong. All it would have taken was 1 member of the House and 1 member of the Senate to reject a state's electors. And had that happened, the House and Senate would have gone to their respective chambers, debated the validity of the electors from those states, and then voted on whether or not to accept them or reject them. And if they rejected them, that would have been perfectly constitutional. And in the case of the 2020 election, would have been proper. Has that ever happened before? Well, not to the point of actually rejecting them. But if you recall, when Donald Trump won the 2016 election, Democrat Congressman Jim McGovern of Massachusetts, Democrat Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland, Democrat Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal of Washington, Democrat Congressman Raul Grijalva of Arizona, Democrat Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas, Democrat Congresswoman Barbara Lee of California, and Democrat Congresswoman Maxine Waters, also of California, they all objected to some of Trump's electoral college votes. And had any senators also objected, which none did, but had any senators objected, a vote would have been taken as to whether or not to accept those votes. And if the House and Senate both voted to reject them, well, they wouldn't have counted. And if that meant that there was no electoral college majority, then the Constitution provides for that. Had Congress done the right thing and rejected the electors from Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, California, and New Jersey, neither Trump, Pence, nor Biden, Harris would have received a majority of the Electoral College votes. What would have happened? Well, the Constitution provides for that. And that process is that the House would have voted for president and the Senate would have voted for vice president. And in that scenario, assuming everybody voted along party lines, Trump, Pence would have been reelected. Why is that? Well, let's start with the Senate. The Republicans on January 6th had a majority in the U.S. Senate. They would have voted for Mike Pence to be vice president. Well, what about in the House? What about for president? The Democrats had a majority in the House on January 6th. Why would Trump have been reelected instead of Biden if people voted along party lines? It's because in such a vote, it would not have been one representative, one vote. There wouldn't have been 435 votes. There would have been 50 votes. Because the process for choosing the president in that scenario is that each state delegation gets a vote. And although the Democrats had a numerical majority overall on January 6, 2021, Republicans had majorities in 26 state delegations. Democrats had majorities in 20 state delegations. And then there were 4 states that were evenly split. So who knows what those 4 states would have done? But it wouldn't have mattered. If they couldn't come to an agreement, who cares? The 26 Republican majority delegations, well, they vote for Trump. He's in. And that's what should have happened. But the Republicans were too cowardly to do anything about it for fear of being labeled traitors or terrorists or Trump-tards or who knows what they'd have been labeled. But Republicans, for the most part, have been spineless for the last 30 years. But had Congress done the right thing, Trump-Pence would have won. And that would have been the constitutional outcome of the 2020 election. Because the elections in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, California, and New Jersey were unconstitutionally conducted and should have been invalidated. Plan B is that the state legislatures choose their electors, in which case Trump, Pence win. Failing that, Plan C, also in the Constitution. The House and Senate pick the president and vice president, respectively, in that order. House picks the president, Senate picks the vice president. That's what should have happened. But that's not what happened, and we knew going in that wasn't what was going to happen, which is why the January 6th speeches, the January 6th protest, and the January 6th riot were so stupid, should never have occurred. But I do want to address that speech, because words matter. And the Democrats and their allies in the fake news have lied about what he said. I'll remind you of what he actually said when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Today is the 3rd anniversary of the violent insurrection in which Donald Trump and his unpatriotic Trump-tard army of un-American domestic terrorist Nazis tried to overthrow the duly elected government of the United States. Okay, so that's what the fake news is saying about it. But what really happened on January 6, 2021, was that President Trump, who believed the 2020 election had been stolen from him, and those beliefs were not without merit, as I've explained earlier on today's program, But between the disgusting Democrats, the destructive deep state operatives, Pelosi's dishonest so-called investigative committee in the House, and the propaganda press that amplifies whatever lies the demon rats want spread, the people who blindly believe what they've been spoon-fed think Trump instructed his supporters to attack the Capitol that day. They have all portrayed Donald Trump's actions that day as inciting an insurrection, that he directed his supporters to storm the Capitol. But the provable truth is that he absolutely did not. Listen to Donald Trump's exact words he used that day in his speech from the Ellipse. Now, this program's almost over, so I'm obviously not going to play the entire speech. But I will play for you the part where he said what his supporters should do. Note his use of the words, "cheer on our brave senators and congressmen," not attack the senators and congressmen. And his use of the words, "peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard," not violently and illegally break into the Capitol to disrupt proceedings. Listen.
Now it is up to Congress to confront this egregious assault on our democracy. And after this, we're going to walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're going to walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women, and we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them, because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. Lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Today we will see whether Republicans stand strong for integrity of our elections.
He said that about 17 minutes into the speech. Now that wasn't incitement at all, was it? And the rest of the speech was about why he believes he won the election, until he concluded with this.
So we're going to walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I love Pennsylvania Avenue. And we're going to the Capitol, and we're going to try and give. The Democrats are hopeless. They're never voting for anything. Not even one vote. But we're going to try and give our Republicans, the weak ones, because the strong ones don't need any of our help. We're going to try and give them the kind of pride and boldness that they need to take back our country. So let's walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. I want to thank you all. God bless you, and God bless America. Thank you all for being here. This is incredible. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That's not incitement either. Nothing in his speech was incitement. Nothing in his speech called for violence. Nothing in his speech asked that crowd to do anything illegal. But the fake news told you he said to violently breach the Capitol. The fake news told you he said to vandalize Nancy Pelosi's office. The fake news told you he said to force lawmakers to seek shelter in the basement. The fake news told you he said to kill police officers. But he said none of that. He didn't even say anything close to it. He said just the opposite. He said to peacefully and patriotically make their voices heard. But the fake news told you he incited the mob and told them to mount a coup to overthrow the government. Why did the fake news say that? They said it because the fake news is, well, fake. I played just a small portion of Donald Trump's speech from January 6th. But go listen to the entire speech yourself. Go watch that speech and learn the truth. Learn the truth that the news media is a bunch of liars. learn that the so-called news media is the enemy of the truth, and that makes them the enemy of the people, along with the demon rats they support. Those evil demon rats are trying to prevent Donald Trump from ever serving as president again via a gross but deliberate misinterpretation and misapplication of the 14th Amendment's prohibition against people who have engaged in an insurrection from serving in office. I don't have time to get into that right now, but 2 weeks ago, that was the subject of my entire show. So if you want to hear it, go to www.themikebatesshow.com and listen to the podcast of my December 23rd show. And read the blog post I did on the subject. That's also at www.themikebatesshow.com on the blog page. The post to look for is dated December 19th. That December 19th blog post and the December 23rd podcast recording of this radio show both explain in great detail why January 6th was not an insurrection and why Donald Trump is not subject to the 14th Amendment's disqualification clause, no matter how badly the demon rats want him to be, or how much they lie about him and about what happened at the Capitol 3 years ago today. It's important that you know the truth. And that's going to require a little bit of effort. Because the fake news sure as hell ain't going to tell you. But I will. I'm Mike Bates. Thanks for listening.